In order for America to advance and truly progress, we must stop looking at things in terms of building on the past and pretty much destroy everything and start in the martial arts order. Here's why. America values the unfocused direction of the world by using science, illusion, and philosophy to destroy morality. The idea being to compartmentalize the population in a system that doesn't allow for the focused incorporation of everything in the minds of its subjects. Language and the resulting social norms, the counterculture included, are two of man's vicious enemies. In 1921, Ludwig Wittgenstein published his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus on the relationship of language to reality and philosophical inquiry. Now let's look at the timeline, and we'll get more into the timeline in part 2. Consider the rise of Omanism in the New Kingdom after the Hyksos were expelled in 1570. This book on ancient Greece, for example, starts the timeline with Greece with the Mycenaeans in the 1600 BC. Okay, so the timeline, and that's not a coincidence. Okay, so let's consider how the migrations went. Basically, Northern Europeans and people from the north of Europe, north of Greece, migrated into Greece and destroyed the Egyptian sort of direction and installed their own direction. And in turn, the Vandals are an example of this. The British, the French, the Greeks, the Romans, they destroyed the Egyptian building and martial arts direction, what was left of it in Egypt, and started to reinvent, vandalize, right, to kind of paint over, destroy artifacts, what have you, and to reinvent the direction in the direction of Europe, and to claim the Egyptians in turn were Europeans. Of course, there is an abundance of evidence that this is not the case. Certainly there were people of European descent in Egypt, but the Greeks didn't even know their way around. They didn't have a system of writing. The earliest evidence of writing in in Greece was 800 BC. The earliest evidence of writing. So if there's a strong Sumerian connection, why didn't you start writing until 800 BC? If there's a strong Egyptian hieroglyphic connection, why not until 800 BC? So when we look at Circe, Pacify, Theseus, Minos, where homosexuality in the West is said to come from, is Crete. The Mycenaean period begins with the Minoan civilization, King Minos in mythology, and contact with Crete. And that period goes from 1600 to 1100 BC. The Dark Age then follows, 1100 to 900 BC. And then the geometric period, 900 to 725 BC. And of course, Pythagoras, right? The Pythagorean theorem, geometry, sacred math, okay, and the play on words, seek, read, mate. We'll get into that later if we have time. This is where we have the earliest evidence of writing. So obviously we have the pyramids and their geometric shape, and then we have the earliest evidence of writing coming into Greece. Now, that is 900 to 725 BC. Then in 725 to 625, we have the Orientalizing period. Okay, the colonization movement begins in 730. Right before that period begins, Homer's Iliad pretty much marks the beginning of the period in 725 BC. The Odyssey, also written by Homer, okay, in 700 BC, also in the Orientalizing period. This is why the left has strong connections with integrating Oriental values and beliefs into this period. Of course, we have the Persians and the various deities they brought to Egypt. This also occurs around the time of this period, certainly, to some degree. So we get the pederasty movement is coming up, okay, about 400 or 500 BCE, but not until after the Archaic period from 650 to 480 BC. Okay, so in the classical period, classical music, right? This is where pederasty becomes popular. It's not a coincidence, right? Ludwig von Beethoven right? I believe his name was. You know what? I don't fucking give a shit what the fuck his name is. He's a bitch. Okay, they're all pedophile scum, and that's what rich people have. It's a bunch of pedophile scum. Okay, 480 to 323, classical, right? Sparta rules Athens, the 30 tyrants in an oligarchy in 404 BC. Socrates is executed in 399 BC, and Plato's Academy in 385. So who did survive this pederastry period? What schools of thought did and what didn't? And what came as a result of them? Classical music. Okay, Socrates, you're questioning the pedophiles. You've got to go. Okay, it's not a coincidence. It's right there. 399, right? 500 BC, 400 BC. Pederastry rampant. 399, Socrates executed. Okay, 14 years later, Plato's Academy. And that leads us eventually to Neoplatonism, and we'll get into that later. Okay, so then it comes to Hel, the deity Hel, who's responsible for the Nephilim, okay, which has to do with the fallen gods and fallen angels of Egypt, right? And the Hellenistic period has everything to do with Egypt, and that's 323 to 331. It's actually 331 BC to 323 BC. Okay, so 331. No, this let me double check this. Basically, we have Hel, right? She's a rough-faced looking woman. During this time, let's see. Man, that's how it has it written here too. Interesting. As 323 to 31. Maybe it's a typo or something. It's actually on this page as well. So that period is sometime around 323 BC, it's safe to say. Okay, so we have the foundation of Alexandria in Egypt in 331. That has everything to do with the Hellenistic period, the Library of Alexandria, which eventually is destroyed, I believe, by the Romans. So now let's go back a little bit. Okay. I'll check on this page first. Okay. Buddhism. What's going on in the East during this time, right? In 552 BC, Buddhism spreads to Japan from Korea. Okay, so we have the Indians and so on. I got over that in the other video. So leading up to this, we have the Greeks' Orientalizing period, 725 to 625 BC. Okay, and then we have the Amen fell when the Assyrians, okay, came into Egypt. So Amen worship fell, and Osirianism rose. That leads us to Serapis with the bishops of Christ, with the Christians and so on. Osiris and Apis. But before that, right before that, we have Baal and Min. The Babylonians allowed for Amen to continue. And remember, the Hyksos are said to worship Set and Min. So Amen and Min are strongly connected, as well as they are connected to Shu. And Shu is basically something that happens as a result of him following the followers of Horus and doing his own thing with Mont, Amen, and touching on Apis and everything. Everyone else basically, gets their rise after Horus the Elder falls. Okay, well, he doesn't really fall. He's basically betrayed by all the despicable philosophies that remain, and those are the philosophies that are said to civilize the world when really it was the martial arts structure from Horus the Elder. So, the reason why Confucianism isn't really accepted, it has to do with comparative mythology, right, and the traditional social roles and structures recommended by Confucius to foster morality, as it was by Mozi and Moism. Okay. All right, so that got kind of confusing. Make a long story short, these are just the details why I've been right all along. Back in 2009, I said whites long ago used to go to Egypt and learn. The Greeks especially, right? It's the Hellenistic period especially, but certainly the geometric period, but certainly before that, the Mycenaeans, certainly if for nothing else, the Minoan civilization was a response to Egypt, and they were basically civilized by the Egyptians, who in turn civilized the Mycenaeans. And during the Orientalizing period, as it ends in 625, there's said to be a Dorian invasion, and the Greeks are said to be the offspring of the Dorians and Ionians as a result. And that goes back to Ionia State Hospital and the stigmatizing black people through psychiatry at Ionia State Hospital. Google it. Okay. So going back to the foundation of Library of Alexandria in Egypt, it leads us up to the Stoics. Now this is very important. The Stoics believe there is no afterlife, and the natural order is what is, and it became the dominant view of the Roman Empire. Okay. Marcus Aurelius defended Stoicism. So they believe there's no afterlife, do what you want, right? Do as thou wilt, like bitch-ass Aleister Crowley, who should, one of the most despicable figures in Western history, really. I think no decent man can deny that. Just utterly despicable, utterly just highlights the shortcomings of science, right? Science and philosophy, psychology. Remember, philosophy used to include biology and all this stuff. You have the different depictions of Da Vinci, right? The Da Vinci Code, the perfect human. They're measuring dimensions. So it has everything to do with these things. It has to do with the difference between white people and black people in terms of metabolic rates, bone density, the curvature of the spine, okay? Coordination, okay, in terms of fighting, okay? And, the differences that are very much problematic when it comes to stealing credit from the black Egyptians. Okay, I mean, it's really self-explanatory that these Egyptians had to have been black originally, and then they started mixing with the Indo-Europeans and the Semites in their region. I mean, it's insane not to see it that way. It's highly delusional. I don't care if it was an all-black genetic team that did the research. And of course, if you really dig deeply, you say that they still haven't determined the genes of the southern Egyptians, who are the ones who civilized Egypt. So when we look at the periods and the location where they draw their DNA tests from, and any kind of person with a passing understanding of Egyptian history would very much see through the bullshit. All right, we look at Epicurus. He says people should maximize world pleasure. The gods don't care anymore. And he is demonized as the Antichrist in the Middle Ages. Then we get Nietzsche, who says God is dead, and all his garbage he spews. Okay, later on. Okay. So when we look at the skeptics in Pyrrho and Anesidemus, 80 BC, okay, they're skeptical about things. We have the cynics at some point. Basically, to make a long story short, the skeptics and the cynics were just basically, they didn't know what to think of anything, so they just reduced themselves to saying we don't believe anything. Okay, that leads us to the Neoplatonism. Right, the intellect, the soul, absolute garbage, Joseph Campbell kind of trash. Just, it makes me want to give up on life when I think it's trash, like utter filth, like Joseph Campbell have influenced society. When I think about Neoplatonic scum, moral relativist filth, the classical period, pederastry, how people think this is what it means to have class. And of course, this has everything to do with classifying people, and so on. Okay, and Law and Order, the wall and the red row. Okay, backwards, Law and Order. So we look at Neoplatonism. This is where you get the idea of the Trinity and the Christian view. Right? They don't have a martial arts perspective to go from because they weren't doing martial arts. Okay, the closest thing to it was an obscure kind of deity that's rarely mentioned in history because the Westerners themselves don't have a high regard for it. And it also has to do with the replacing of the patrician class and so on and so forth, and moving more toward the gender-neutral view. Okay, make a long story short. Westerners were pretty much civilized by homosexuals, and their gender-neutral colonialist mentality is what led to everything. So when you have the conservatives, they're like conservating what's left of the kind of ruffian patriarchy that predates the Mycenaean period in 1600 BC. Okay, and their opposition, kind of fake opposition, controlled opposition, corporate bitch-made, nonsensical opposition. They're both